The modern shipping container was developed in the United States by a man who had owned a trucking business, and his interest was moving containers by ship along the United States Atlantic coast in order to avoid the traffic on the roads. His plan was not to change the world. His plan was not to create globalization, but the container created a new cost structure. Manufacturers could then think of doing away with enormous factories that were vertically integrated and could think of putting each part of their production process in one place or another, wherever it was most beneficial, because they could move the goods that were in process from one place to another at very low cost. This was not a plan. No one envisioned that this would happen.
안녕하세요. 지구본연구소 시청자 여러분, 반갑습니다. 오늘은 제가 그동안 오랫동안 번역을 한다고 하던 책이 한 권 있었습니다. 제가 되게 사랑하는 책이 한 권 있었습니다. 방금 화면에 보이시는 이 더 박스라는 책이 있는데요. 사실 이 책은 어떻게 보면 컨테이너 박스와 관련돼서 세계화와 관련된 여러 가지 이야기를 전해주는 그러한 책이었습니다. 저한테는 세계화가 어떻게 진행이 됐는지, 그리고 그런 것이 컨테이너 박스와 어떻게 연결이 됐는지를 잘 알려주는 이제 그러한 책이었죠. 그래서 저는 이 책을 본 이후로 세계화에 대해서 많은 관심을 이제 가지게 되었고, 그래서 마침 이 마크레빈슨 선생님께서 쓰신 아웃사이더 박스라는 책이 나왔다는 사실을 알자마자 바로 전자책으로 구해서 열심히 읽다가 결국 이제 번역까지 하게 됐습니다. 그래서 이 책 출간에 맞춰서 우리 마크레빈슨 선생님께서 한국을 방문하신 좋은 기회를 잡아서 이참에 여러분들과 함께 이 책 그리고 세계화에 관한 여러 가지 이야기들을 한번 해보도록 하겠습니다. 스튜디오에 마크레빈슨 선생님께서 나오셨습니다. 안녕하세요.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me to join you today.
네, 감사합니다. 몇 가지 질문을 제가 좀 드리려고 합니다. 저는 박스 그리고 아웃사이더 박스를 통해서 세계화 그리고 이제 글로벌 공급망에 대해서 어떻게 선생님께서 그렇게 끊임없이 탐구를 해나가고 계신데, 선생님께서 이제 이 주제 세계화 그리고 글로벌라이제이션이라는 주제에 대해서 관심을 가지게 된 배경이 무엇인지가 제일 궁금하고요. 그리고 그 과정에서 어떻게 보면 세계화에 대해서 뭔가 인사이트, 깨달음 이런 것이 있다면 무엇인지 한번 시청자분들께 말씀해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
I'm very interested in international trade and international economics. Part of the reason I studied about shipping and the box is that I felt economists were paying too much attention to things that government did. There was a lot of attention to tariffs and trade negotiations and those sorts of things. And no one had really paid attention to how technology changed the way that companies engaged in trade. There was a huge increase in international trade starting at a time in the late 20th century when the world economy was not very good. And why was that? Normally, trade does not grow strongly when the world economy is weak. And the answer, I discovered, is because this change in shipping methods really changed the way companies could organize their business. The dramatic decline in the cost of shipping, along with the falling cost of telecommunication, made it possible for companies to create international supply chains for manufactured goods, and these simply did not exist before. So I found this story quite fascinating, and that's why I pursued it.
아웃사이더 박스에서 보면 세계화에 대한 이제 몇 가지 말씀을 해주셨는데요. 제가 이해하기로는 세 가지 요소인 것 같습니다. 일단 사람의 인식의 전환, 그리고 빠르고 정확한 정보 획득 수단, 그리고 말씀하셨던 대로 안정적이고 저렴한 수송 수단, 요 세 가지가 합쳐지면 이제 세계화, 글로벌라이제이션이라는 게 생겨나는 것 같은데, 이게 역사적으로 보면 이제 19세기 말에서 20세기 초반, 그 다음에 저희가 지금 겪고 있는 두 번째 이제 세컨드 글로벌라이제이션이 있는 것 같은데, 이런 상황에서 봤을 때 2022년은 이러한 세계화가 이제 붕괴되는 어떠한 그러한 시점이라고 봐야 될까요? 아니면 일시적인 잠시 지나가는 그러한 변화의 어떤 과정이라고 생각을 해야 될지, 이것이 궁금합니다.
I think that the nature of globalization is changing. I don't think it is helpful to talk about a reduction of globalization because I don't think that's what's going on. We've been through different forms of globalization in the past. We had very rapid growth in international trade in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. But all of this trade was in commodities, much of it from colonies to their central governments in Europe. And Europe was very much at the middle of that. There was a lot of international investment, but all of that international investment came from Europe. So there was globalization, but it was very Europe-centered. Then we had another type of globalization starting after World War II. This really was driven by governments reducing trade barriers, reducing tariffs, reducing quotas, opening their economies to trade, and also then by a very large growth in petroleum trade. This went on from perhaps 1948 until the early 1980s. And then it came to an end because of the debt crisis and the oil crisis. And again, we saw international trade grow very rapidly for a period, and then it fell relative to the world economy. I think everyone was surprised starting in the late 1980s when there was a new type of globalization. And that involved building these long, complicated international supply chains. Most of what is traded through those supply chains is what economists call intermediate goods. These are parts, components. These are things that were made in one country and are being shipped to another country for further processing. So this is a very different type of trade than the world has known before. And the rapid growth of this sort of trade is really what drove this most recent form of globalization. We saw that international trade grew more than twice as fast as the world economy for 20 years. 20 years. And then starting in the financial crisis, that came to an end. Okay. And since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, international trade has grown more slowly than the world economy. It hasn't collapsed, but international trade is no longer leading the world economy. And I think looking forward, we will continue to see that trade in goods grows more slowly than the world economy. It doesn't stop. Globalization is not over, but it will not be the main source of growth in the world economy. I think that we are seeing increasing trade in services, digital services especially, and that will continue to grow. I think we're also seeing that services are more and more source of value in manufactured goods. The physical assembly of goods is not really what matters so much in today's world. The value really comes from the intellectual content. And that can be moved around the world very easily. This is really where globalization is headed, in my opinion, and goods will play a smaller and smaller role in it.
제가 이 책에서 봤을 때 제일 재밌던, 어떻게 보면 글로벌라이제이션의 이제 역사, 세계화의 역사와 관련해서 보면 이러한 요소들이 19세기 후반, 20세기 초반에 한번 등장을 했고 지금 다시 등장을 했는데, 이런 세계화 과정이라는 것이, 세계화라는 것이 역사적으로 봤을 때 필연적인 과정인지 아니면 역사적인 우연이 겹치면서 발생하는 어떤 보기 드문 현상인지, 여기에 대한 저자분의 생각이 좀 궁금합니다.
I think companies are very sensitive to costs.
Company.
What happened with the box and also with telecommunications is that costs suddenly began to change. They began to fall. The shipping container, the box, made it possible to send goods more cheaply than before, more reliably than before, and faster than before. And when this developed internationally, companies began to look at the possibilities. This was not deliberate. The modern shipping container was developed in the United States by a man who had owned a trucking business, and his interest was moving containers by ship along the United States Atlantic coast in order to avoid the traffic on the roads. His plan was not to change the world. His plan was not to create globalization, but the container created a new cost structure. Manufacturers could then think of doing away with enormous factories that were vertically integrated and could think of putting each part of their production process in one place or another, wherever it was most beneficial, because they could move the goods that were in process from one place to another at very low cost. This was not a plan. No one envisioned that this would happen. And then when this was combined in the 1980s with the falling cost of telecommunications and the improvement of the computer, it became possible to manage a supply chain from one place, and you could talk in real time to factory managers in other places. You could oversee your supply chain in a much closer manner than had been possible before. So it's wrong to think about this as a plan. It's wrong to think about this as an intention. What you have is changes in the cost structure of transportation and communication, and companies looking to make a profit changing their behavior because their costs are different.
결국은 어떻게 보면 기업의 이윤이 이제 이러한 많은 변화의 요인을 가져왔다라고 이제 생각을 할 수 있는데, 저는 요즘에 조금 이제 걱정이 되는 사항들이 있어서 이것도 한번 좀 여쭤보고 싶습니다. 최근 이제 미국은 어떻게 보면 뭐 보조금, 그 다음에 첨단 제조업에 대한 뭐 미국 내 리쇼어링 이런 것들을 본격적으로 추진을 하고 있는데, 이걸 보다 보면 뭐 인플레이션 리덕션 액트 같은 걸 보면 이제 시장하고 투자를 이렇게 교환하는 형태로 많이 이제 진행이 되는 것 같아요. 그리고 점차 이런 것들이 이제 미국뿐만 아니고 유럽에서도 현재 여러 가지 관련 제도들을 만들고 2023년부터는 시행할 것 같은데, 선생님이 보시기에는 어떻게 보면 이러한 시장과 투자가 서로 교환되는 어떠한 이러한 룰들이, 보조금을 지급한다든지 이런 것들이 이제 미국 이외에 다른 지역으로도 확산될 가능성이 있는지에 대해서 좀 궁금하고요. 그 다음에 현재는 이런 것들이 뭐 반도체라든지 2차 전지 같은 첨단 제조업에 국한되어 있는데 다른 쪽으로도 더 확산될 가능성이 있다라고 보시는지에 대해서 좀 궁금합니다.
Long before COVID and long before the Inflation Reduction Act, manufacturers and retailers had become increasingly concerned about supply chain disruption. There have been too many cases in which something didn't work in the supply chain, and a retailer did not have its merchandise when it wanted, or a factory could not operate because a part did not arrive on time. So even before COVID, we saw companies thinking about how to make their supply chains more resilient. What this has meant is that companies have tried to move away carefully from simply focusing on production costs. In many industries, if you look only at production costs, what you want to do is build a very large factory because there are economies of scale. But what happens if there's a fire at that factory? What happens if there's a strike at that factory? What happens if there's an earthquake at that factory? Then your production is totally disrupted, and it can be very dangerous to the company. So we have seen a move away from this type of production and to manufacturers establishing multiple production locations in different countries. Maybe it costs a little more to make something in different countries rather than just in one place, but it's like insurance. You're paying for some protection. So if production is disrupted at one factory, you have other sources. These trends were already underway before COVID and before the Inflation Reduction Act. This does not necessarily mean reshoring, as people call the term. We do not see a lot of production moving from low-wage countries to high-wage countries, for example. What we see is many companies are moving some of their production closer to where their customers are. So you might make something in 3 different factories rather than in one factory, and you might have a factory in Asia and a factory in the Americas and a factory in Europe.
Yeah.
Perhaps nearshoring is a better word than reshoring.
Nearshoring.
The reshoring story is a very limited story. We're seeing, as you point out, that the United States is now very much promoting domestic production of semiconductors. But that is not going to be a totally vertically integrated supply chain. There are simply too many parts to that supply chain, and it's not going to be practical to move everything to the United States, even if the government wants to. I think we will see the same with vehicles. It's what's provided in the Inflation Reduction Act is a special benefit for vehicles that are totally made in North America. Not just the United States, but United States, Canada, Mexico.
Yeah.
I think we will see that will change because there are some very high costs to that, and it limits the flexibility of manufacturers. I think it's not efficient for a manufacturer to say that every part of every model of every car must be made in North America.
North America, yeah.
And so I think that over time that model is going to change. But we certainly do see a concern that the electric vehicle industry might be dominated by China. And so the United States and the European Union and Japan are all taking action to make sure that their own vehicle industries have some opportunity to play there. I'm sure that there will be similar discussions in Korea. So I don't see this having quite as serious effect as some people seem to think. I don't think it's going to spread to many other industries. You referred to high-tech industries, but there are many parts of high-tech industries that are not going to move in this way. For example, medical equipment. This is very high technology. More of the semiconductors will probably be made in the United States and in Europe and in Korea and in Japan. But will more of the machinery be assembled in those countries? I'm not so sure that will be the case. We're seeing a lot of manufacturing of high technology move from China to Vietnam, to India, to Thailand. So there's going to be more diversity in where things are made. There are just too many different items in a supply chain to move them all. You know, that after COVID began, there was a discussion in the United States about how much of the pharmaceutical medications come from other countries. And there were many people who said, we have to make this in the United States. What they were thinking about was a factory that makes the pill. Okay? Well, that's just a plant. It makes pills one after another.
Yeah.
But there are many different chemicals that go into those pills. There are systems for delivering the medications.
Yeah.
If you put something in your arm or here, some medications need to be delivered that way. It's not just manufacturing a pill. And it's simply not practical to take all of those different stages in the manufacturing process and move them. And I think people have discovered that.
네. 다음 질문은 이런 세계화와 관련돼서 항상 우리가 이야기 꼭 나오는 것이 우리 이웃인 이제 중국에 관한 이야기죠. 사실 중국은 지난 1978년 이후 2022년 약 44년 동안 이제 개혁 개방 노선을 이제 진행을 해왔습니다. 근데 이제 최근 중국이 보여주는 모습들은 이런 개혁 개방 노선에서 좀 벗어난 어떻게 보면 근본적인 변화를 좀 꾀하는 것이 아닌가 싶습니다. 사실 역사적으로 대한민국 시청자분들은 잘 아시겠지만 명나라가 들어서면서 먼 나라에서부터 갑자기 이제 폐쇄적인 국가로 이제 확 변했었죠. 그래서 어떻게 보면 저는 중국이 그럴 가능성이 있지 않을까라는 생각도 좀 드는데 어떻게 보면 마크레빈슨 선생님께서는 이제 2020년대 앞으로 이제 한 7, 8년 남은 이 시간 동안에 중국이 뭔가 이제 변화된 국제 질서에 맞춰서 어떻게 대응하고 또 변화해 갈 것인지, 과거와 같은 모습일 것인지 아니면 좀 다른 모습으로 변해 나갈 것인지 이런 거에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시는지 좀 궁금합니다.
I don't want to predict what China will do. I'm not a China expert. I would make a couple of observations about what's going on now in the economy. One is that because many other countries are not satisfied with China's policies, particularly its economic policies in many cases, they are not wanting Chinese products as much. Okay? Well, being able to export is a very important part of industrial competitiveness. You saw that here in Korea during Korea's development. The government very strongly supported Korean companies, but it told those companies, you must export so your products will be at the international standard. We're not going to support you just to serve the Korean market, because then you will not be on the technological leading edge. If Chinese products cannot be sold in the world markets of the advanced economies, then they will not stay on the leading edge. This is a problem, I think, facing the Chinese government, that they need to have access to other countries' markets in order to force their own companies to keep up with the technology, keep the most advanced production methods, to have the latest products. And not having that access could be a problem. The other thing I want to say is that China has benefited greatly from what I call the exchange of ideas. Many people from China have studied in other countries, in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in Japan, perhaps in Korea. And that's been of great benefit to China. China has been able to get the latest ideas, the latest research. If countries are now discouraging Chinese students in certain fields, that's very bad for China. If countries think that it might hurt them if they let Chinese students come and study physics or computer engineering or other advanced fields, then the Chinese students will not have access to the latest developments in these fields. And so I think it's going to be important for China to maintain relations with other countries so that Chinese students are welcome. It's just not good to cut your country off from international exchange in that way. And I don't think China has been cut off yet, but the trends are not good. There are fewer Chinese students studying abroad now. There are foreign universities asking questions about who are these Chinese students and do we want them here? And this is not going to be a good thing for China if it continues to go this way.
결국은 이제 중국이 개혁 개방 어떤 그 국제적인 질서와 교류 이런 것들이 이제 매우 중요하고 그런 것들이 막힌다 그러면 결국 중국 입장에서 봤을 때는 여러 가지로 상당히 불리한 조건일 수밖에 없다. 라는 이제 말씀을 해주셨는데 처음부터 이제 본인께서 이제 중국 전문가가 아니라는 말씀을 명확히 하시면서 이제 예측에 대해서는 상당히 조심스러운 말씀을 하셨는데 사실 저는 이제 아웃사이더 박스를 보면서 그런 생각이 들었어요. 이제 과거 세계화 시절에 대공황 시절 1930년대 각국이 이제 관세를 이제 이렇게 올리면서 시장과 어떻게 보면은 투자가 교환하는 형태가 되어 가는 것 같았었는데 현재 진행되고 있는 2022년에 진행되고 있는 여러 가지 모습들이 1930년대 유럽 국가에서 벌어지고 있는 모습들과 좀 유사한 것이 아닌가라는 생각이 드는데 이거 저만의 생각인지 아니면 선생님께서도 그렇게 생각하시는지 궁금합니다.
We're not going to have another depression like we had in the 1930s. I think the world is very different. And I do think that thoughtful people in many countries understand the dangers of cutting themselves off from the world economy. Technology plays a much more important part in every country's economy now than it did in the 1930s. And no country wants to be cut off from the latest technology. So I don't see us going in the direction of the 1930s. I do see that the international trade in goods will become less and less important over the coming years. There are several reasons for that. One is that we are getting older. Okay. The population in Korea is growing very slowly, the population, yes? And the average age is rising.
Yeah.
The same is true in many other countries. There are now some countries where half the people are almost 50 years old. Older people don't buy as many goods.
Yeah.
Older people already have their houses, already have their furniture,
Yeah.
already have their clothes. So the demographic forces that have driven globalization, the rapid population growth in the world, that's done with. Even China is near peak population. And I think that this means that one source of demand for all of these goods is going to go away. Another source of demand for goods is going to disappear for technological reasons. You mentioned the switch earlier to electric vehicles. Vehicle parts, vehicle components account for perhaps 4 or 5% of the goods traded internationally. Many of those components will no longer be needed as the world shifts to electric vehicles. An electric car has several thousand fewer parts than an internal combustion car. So there are a lot of goods like that that just are not going to be needed anymore. You see this very much in industrial equipment, the machines that are used in factories. Those machines, on average, are getting older. Why? Because when your machine gets out of date, you can often fix that problem by updating the software rather than buying new hardware. And so we've seen many things going on in the world that will tend to lessen the growth of trade. We're all very much aware that a lot of things that were formerly traded as goods are now traded as services. There was a time when I owned a stereo. The stereo had several pieces.
Yeah.
All of those pieces had to be shipped across the ocean. Now I buy music as a service. I don't own a phonograph. I don't own a tape recorder.
Yeah.
So the world is changing in this way, and that means that there is going to be much slower growth, I think, in demand for goods. But I see the demand for international exchange of services being very strong. The trade in services internationally is not measured very well. We really don't have any idea how much trade there is. The trade statistics are based on measuring transactions where money changes hands. But if you go onto the internet and you go to a website that is based in the United Kingdom, no trade has occurred. That's not measured as trade, right?
Yeah.
If you are a company based in Seoul and you have your subsidiary in India and it does the accounting for you and it's all within the company, no trade has occurred. There's nothing to measure because there's no transaction. So we have a very poor idea of how much trade in services exists, but the evidence is that it continues to grow very strongly, and it will be a more and more important part of globalization in the years ahead.
네. 어떻게 보면 이제 기술과 이러한 발전들이 이제 새로운 형태로 이제 바뀌어 나가는 것뿐이지 과거로 가지는 않을 것이다. 그런데 이제 물론 그 과정에서 뭐 여러 가지 고령화라든지 수요의 축소 이런 것들은 이제 불가피한 면이 있지만 어떻든간에 이제 국제적인 교역의 질서와 이제 흐름들은 이어가겠지만 서비스 그리고 소프트웨어 이런 쪽 어떻게 보면 무형의 자산들이 이동하는 거에 대해서 우리는 현재 정확하게 측정하거나 평가할 방법이 부족하기 때문에 이것들을 이제 이해하는 건 좀 어렵다라는 말씀을 이제 해주셨는데 여러 가지 말씀을 쭉 해주셨는데 저는 마지막 질문 어떻게 보면 한국에 오셨으니까 제가 대한민국 국민으로서 한번 여쭤보고 싶어요. 대한민국은 그 동안에 이제 세계화 그리고 이제 글로벌 서플라이 체인이라는 걸 통해서 어떻게 보면은 제 생각에는 가장 많은 이득을 본 나라가 대한민국인 것 같습니다. 근데 한편으로 보면 최근 들어서 이제 여러 가지 이런 세계화가 취약해지고 공급망이 좀 분열되는 상황과 더불어서 내부적으로는 이제 인구 감소 그리고 고령화에 따른 이제 노동력 부족 이런 것들이 모습들이 지금 나타나고 있습니다. 세계화에 대해서 가장 전문가로서 그동안 많은 것을 보셨을 텐데 이런 미래, 변화하는 미래에서 대한민국의 미래는 어떻다고 생각하시는지 한번 의견 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
First, let me emphasize that I am not a Korea expert. You know that. In the process of development, Korea did one thing that was extremely important. It emphasized education.
Education.
So Korea has a very well-educated labor force.
Yeah.
Korea has many people who have very good technological skills. And I think that is a big advantage for Korea in the future of globalization. Around the world now, we're seeing that in most of the wealthy countries, and Korea, I think, is now a wealthy country, people don't want to do certain types of work. If they can avoid it, many people really don't want to work in factories. Many people don't really want to drive trucks. People don't, in most cases, want to do hard physical labor if they can avoid it.
Construction site.
That's right. And some of those jobs can be automated. I think we're going to see more and more automation of some of those things so that manufactured goods are made by machines. And fewer people are actually involved in the process of physical production. So what do the people do? They manage the machine, and it takes a lot of training and education to be able to do this. Korea has a labor force with the skills to do well in that world, I think. So I think Korea's policies from the past have given it some advantages, and I hope that Korea will be able to take advantage of that in the future.
감사합니다. 세계화와 관련된 아웃사이더 박스와 관련돼서 제가 번역한 책에 대해서 여러 가지 또 궁금한 추가적인 사항들을 이제 여쭤봤습니다. 어떻든 간에 대한민국은 뭐 여러 가지로 잘 교육된 인구 그리고 학습된 여러 가지 기계화에 대한 여러 가지 능력 등등을 통해서 앞으로 잘 성장을 해나갈 것이다라고 이제 말씀을 해주셨습니다. 사실 뭐 정답이 어디 있겠습니까? 다들 잘 해나가는 어떻게 보면 우리가 그동안 정해진 길을 따라간 것이 아닌 것처럼 앞으로도 잘 해나갈 것이라는 덕담이시라고 생각을 하지만 저 역시 그렇게 잘 될 것이라고 생각이 듭니다. 어떻게 보면 좀 저도 새롭게 책을 한번 번역을 해서 이런 자리를 만드는 게 되게 영광이고요. 세계적인 전문가 마크레빈슨 선생님과 함께 아웃사이더 박스 그리고 세계화에 대한 여러 가지 이야기를 진행해 봤습니다. 다음 시간에는 새로운 이야기로 여러분들을 찾아뵙도록 하겠습니다. 지금까지 시청해 주신 여러분 대단히 감사하고요. 마크레빈슨 선생님 이거 나와주셔서 대단히 감사합니다.
Thank you very much.
복잡하고 어렵게 느껴지는 재무제표와 용어들 친절한 투자 멘토 사경인 마스터가 매주 새로운 콘텐츠로 알기 쉽게 설명해드립니다. 재무제표 분석과 포트폴리오 구성
뭐 양대 재무제표라고 그러면 대차대조표랑 손익계산서가 있거든요.
매수 매도 방법
이때 사는 게 좋겠네 이렇게 사면 좋겠다 근데 이렇게 살려면 뭘 해야 되냐면요 나머지 3분의 1은 놔둬봅니다 어디까지 가는지
실전 투자 팁까지 알려드립니다. 오직 3프로 멤버십에서만 만나실 수 있습니다.